Welcome everyone to the NSF UNOLS AGU Early Career Scientist Training Series. This is the first in a presentation in a series of presentations that we will be making this fall that has to do with the early career cruise that has been funded by NSF going to the East Pacific Rise. My name is Dan Fornari. I'm an emeritus research scholar here at Woods Hole Oceanographic in the Geology and Geophysics Department. I'm a marine geologist and have been studying hydrothermal processes and volcanic processes on mid-ocean ridges for the past 30, 40 years. I am going to be one of the presenters, and my longtime colleague, Mike Perfit at the University of Florida, will be the other presenter. And I'll let Mike introduce himself now.
Hi, ECS people. I am Mike Perfit. I'm at the University of Florida in Gainesville, Florida. As with Dan, I've been in this field for 20, 30, 40 years maybe now. Dan and I were actually graduate students together at Lamont back in the 70s. And I'm a petrologist, geochemist, sometimes marine geologist, but most of my work has been done on the seafloor. And many of those cruises and studies have been done with Dan over the years.
Okay, with that sort of brief introduction to both of us, you can certainly find out more about us. And also I would encourage you to look at the various PDFs that we have linked to the Dropbox site that have to do with a bunch of research articles and review articles about the East Pacific Rise in the 9 to 10 North area. We're going to be covering a couple of topics today. Both Mike and I will be sort of handing off between some of these topics, but basically we're going to be talking a little bit about the mapping context for where we're going to be doing the 4 Alvin and Sentry dives in December. We'll talk a little bit about the EPR axis and the crustal volcanic terrain that is there at 950 and the axial summit trough, the AST. A little bit about the eruption history, because the East Pacific Rise is a place where 2 documented eruptions have occurred at the same location on the mid-ocean ridge. And then we'll finish up by talking a little bit about Alvin and Sentry diving and sampling and mapping capabilities, and what we'll need to do to coordinate the dive planning and the work that will be done by the shipboard early career scientists in coordination with folks on shore and with the various mentors that will be on board the ship. So these are the facilities that you'll see that we'll be using. At the left, you'll see the RV Atlantis, the mothership for Alvin. Alvin at the right side, a 4,500 meter capable submersible that takes 2 observers and 1 pilot. That's the only submersible in the world that takes 2 scientific observers. And Sentry, the autonomous vehicle that has a 6,000 meter capability that we will also be using for our studies. So I'll just start by giving you a very brief introduction. The East Pacific Rise has been mapped since the 1960s. Henry Menard at Scripps was one of the initial scientists that did much of the mapping. It was initially called the Albatross Plateau. The East Pacific Rise is a fast-spreading mid-ocean ridge. You see on the left-hand diagram the multi-beam map that was made back in the 80s and early 90s, largely by folks like Ken McDonald, Jeff Fox, Bill Ryan, Peter Lonsdale, and others. And that shows the ridge axis, which is, if you can see my little arrow here, that shows the ridge axis here along in the sort of orange-brown colors as the very linear ridge segments between the offsetting transforms. This is the Siqueiros transform here at about 8 degrees 20, the Clipperton transform here at about 10 degrees north, and then the Orozco transform up here at around 13 or so north. And this is the along axis profile of that, sorry, about 15 north, at the long axis profile of the ridge axis, showing the sort of mean depth of about 2,500 meters. This is a flat version of a portion of that map showing the area where we'll be focusing our studies right here, where I have my cursor at the 950 area. This is right adjacent to the Lamont Seamounts, this linear chain of seamounts that extends in an absolute motion relative trend to the west of the East Pacific Rise axis. And this is a high area here. It's one of the highest points between the Clipperton and Sequeiros transforms, and it's the place where we have been looking at hydrothermal vents and mapping hydrothermal vents since the late 1980s. And these little stars that you see here on this inset map show the location of high and low temperature vents at the 950 area. Here's a slightly different perspective of part of that map, again, to give you some context. The Clipperton transform, we're looking to the west-southwest here, up to the top of the frame. Here's the Clipperton transform fault here that offsets the East Pacific Rise as it goes north. And then the western portion here, you can see that this area has been affected by melt anomalies in the mantle. It's got magmatism that spills over the ridge transform intersection. The Lamont seamounts is this chain of seamounts that I talked to you just a minute ago about. And then where we're going to be looking is in this area that's just off this map, but is the highest point on the EPR between Clipperton and Sequeiros in the 950 area, in the 950 minutes north area. One of the important aspects of the East Pacific Rise in this area is that it has been extensively mapped using a variety of techniques. We've been studying it in detail for the last couple of decades. Here you see an example of the embedded ABE bathymetry. So this is a 5-meter grid of bathymetry here that was one of the first sort of near-bottom bathymetric surveys done by ABE. The other one was done down in the southern East Pacific Rise with a program for John Sinton. But in this area here, ABE did a superb job of mapping using a mechanically scanned sonar at an altitude of about 30 or 40 meters from the bottom. And this map is embedded within the larger 80 to 100 meter gridded data of the multi-beam that you see in this more amorphous colors surrounding the detailed map. And then to the right, you'll see a flat map of that same data set with the hydrothermal vents shown as red dots. And you can see the sort of delicate scallop nature of the flow fronts. And if you look closely, you'll be able to see some of the lava channels. We'll talk more about this in a little bit, but these are important distinguishing features of a fast spreading ridge axis that is characteristic of the types of volcanic eruptions that occur here. Now, what I want to do in this small movie is to sort of give you a sense of how we've used some of these data to conceptualize what actually happens during a mid-ocean ridge eruption at a fast spreading ridge. So this first panel that you see is the multi-beam bathymetry, and everything has now been co-registered. And then all of a sudden, you're going to see the ABE 5-meter gridded bathymetry, and then that will go ahead and fade out. And then underneath it, you will see the side scan data. This is the DSL 120 kilohertz side scan data with, sorry, I'm gonna have to start that over again. Apologize, I clicked on too many things here. So the multi-beam bathymetry, and then it fades into the ABE microbathymetry, and then that fades into the DSL 120 side scan sonar. When we're out there with Alvin in December, or with Sentry in December, we're going to be acquiring near bottom multi-beam data at about 1 meter pixel resolution, and side scan data using a using an EdgeTech side scan, and that will allow us to get about similarly about a 0.5 meter to 1 meter pixel resolution side scan data that's co-registered. So in this cartoon, what I did was simply conceptualize what happens when you erupt lavas from the axial trough. And in fact, what we've seen in the past is that most of the volcanic fissures are located within this very narrow 40 to 80 meter wide axial fissure in the axial trough. I've conveniently rafted off 10,000 years worth of lava flows, and I faulted them a little bit in that black line that you see. And then what I'm focusing on now is the fact that you have the eruptions now can also occur where you have lava channels, these dark flat areas. They can go and be ponded against the fault They can use the pre-existing lava channels as avenues for where you can distribute lavas off axis. And much of these sort of conceptual ideas have been borne out by the results that we've seen in the recent eruptive history of the EPR of this area, the 2005-2006 eruption, and we'll discuss that in a minute. But this just gives you an idea of how you might be able to use the high resolution data, the bathymetry and side scan data, to figure out what may have happened in the past and how the lava flows erupted, where they went, and how you've basically repaved the seafloor. And then you can look at those flow fronts, and you can see that they match quite well with the side scan data and with the bathymetry data. So this just gives you a little bit of a view towards some of what you can do and the value in getting these kind of data sets to be able to study mid-ocean ridge volcanic processes. All right, what I'm going to do now is jump ahead a little bit. This is a sonar image that was acquired in 2007 using JASON, the ROV. It was acquired using the DSL 120 sonar, but also there were dives with JASON that acquired multi-beam bathymetry, near bottom multi-beam bathymetry, in these areas where you see these fine scale yellow track lines, and the red track lines are the along axis multi-beam data. So these are some perspective images of that multi-beam bathymetry collected by JASON in 2007. Part of the context and part of the reason why I'm showing these to you is that you can see that we have a wealth of time series data pertaining to the near bottom bathymetry of this part of the ridge axis that's going to help us determine if there may have been an eruption in the very recent past, since 2005-2006. So we have a large volume of really great high resolution data that we will be using to develop our sort of strategies for how we're going to be able to investigate this site, and those will all be available to the early career participants that are involved. So I will keep going here. This is just a detailed section of a part of that data set. These small scale features that you see here, some of them are lava pillars, which Mike will talk about in a minute. Some of them are hydrothermal vents, but the resolution of these data are such that you can, in fact, resolve the very fine small scale characteristics of the morphology of the volcanic and hydrothermal features here within the axis. And finally, just to put a bit of icing on the cake, in 2011, Scott Nooner and Vicky Farini were out with JASON and also collected additional near bottom multi-beam data, and they've made that available to us. This is a map showing their data, and there are a number of features that are consistent throughout the various years. This small offset that you see of the axial trough is real, and that seems to have persisted throughout the various eruption cycles. These breakouts seem to also persist, and some of them have channeled more recent lavas out to the side, there and there. These white lines are what we'll be discussing in the next couple of months in terms of how we might plan the initial sentry dives to take advantage of being able to remap this area to see if there have been any more recent eruptions in this area. I'll turn this over to Mike now to talk a little bit about some of the volcanic terrain.
Right, thanks. Hopefully you can hear me. Dan, you can hear me okay?
Yep, you're fine.
All right, good. So one of the things that we've done over the years is basically try to map the seafloor like you would as a land-based geologist in some ways. You only get limited looks, but we have a good idea from going across axis and along axis. Obviously, a lot of dives have been in the axis, but one of the things that is unique in this area is that we've had many dives going across axis, and we've also used what's called a wax rock core to sample across axis out to about 4 kilometers. So we have a good idea what's happening. On the maps you see there, basically our decision on what the geology looks like in the colors is that there's a neovolcanic zone that we would characterized as having relatively recent flows. A lot of that has been either paved or repaved by the 1991-92 flows, first one we saw, or the 2005-2006 flows. The comparison is on the right-hand side, which is the side scan sonar that we've interpreted on the left. There are lots of little channel ways, and a lot of that scallop features you will see in a second are lobate flows. And this may be a little surprise to you that we're not talking about pillows. Pillows are actually fairly rare, and they may occur in off-axis eruptions. You see the blue are mounds. Those are pillow mounds. We don't believe that all of them have formed on axis, and many of them may have formed along fissures along the east and west side, where you start to get abyssal hill formation. So we're gonna show you sort of our own artist perception of what the axis looks like and what it looks like off axis, based upon our very many dives and our vivid imaginations of how to put this all together. But this is probably the most well-studied and characterized portion of a mid-ocean ridge anywhere, just because we've had so many cruises, Ridge 2000, Ridge first in the 1990s, and then Ridge 2000 for another 10 years. So we've had 20 years of people looking at this ridge crest, and you're fortunate to be able to go over and see it now where we know so much about it. Next one, Dan. So this is our artist conception. Dan and I put together a sketch of what we thought we could see. Now remember, when you're down in Alvin, you can see in front of you how many meters, Dan? Maybe 20 meters before the light?
Not quite so much. Maybe 7 to 10 meters is where the light basically goes away in front of the sun.
Right. So you never get a view. You have to put together with a bunch of snapshots in your head, and of course the photos that we take to put together what it looks like. So here we're looking north, basically along the axial summit trough. It's probably a little narrower here than it really is. It can be wider than this, but it's good representation. If you look to the left on the upper right, you see that it's fairly flat looking, and there's a pillow mound there on the far right. There's again, the pillows are relatively rare, and they may have actually erupted off axis. And then a little bit inboard towards the axis itself are the lobate terrain. And these are sort of interconnected, flat, sort of pancake-like flows that collapse due to what we think happens as these flows interact with the saturated seafloor, saturated with seawater, creating a vapor phase which causes them to sort of bubble up. And that vapor holds them up, but eventually that vapor cools off and they collapse again. So when you land on them, they can actually break. But in many cases, you will see open cavities in them that have a fairly complex interior. They are unlike pillow lavas at all. And then others, which we don't show here, like on the floor of the AST, these stripy things are a bit like Pahoehoe flows, where you have very rapid flows that fold over on each other, forming chaotic flows sometimes, other times where you get swirls. That all would have come from the fissures within the axial summit trough. And if you can imagine that trough being filled up as like a lava lake or a lava channel, it flows over the side. The flows rapidly go downslope. The faster they go and the more the slope is great, the more you get sheet flows where they're flat and they may roll over on themselves. And if they slow down a bit, you get lobates. And if they get really slow, like near the termini, away from the axis, you may get some pillow tubes. The other things you see in here are the chimneys, which almost all of them, I think other than one, are all in the axis themselves. The sulfide chimneys, you see Dan pointing to them. And then things called pillars, lava pillars. And there's one in the forefront there. Very often they're concentrated along the edges and they're holding up the walls, forming sort of cathedral-like structures. Sometimes they actually are right in the middle. They've survived. They would form as basically vapor pipes, sort of bubble channels, as seawater vaporizes and comes up through the lava lake. And because they're colder than the solidus, the solid point of the lava, they basically form a solid channel that even after the fluid lavas drain away or drain out, they wind up remaining. So they're unusual features, and sometimes they can actually have hydrothermal fluids coming out of them. We saw that during the 91-92 eruption. The other thing you see there is talus around the bottom, like at the base of that pillar. When the roof finally collapses, when there's drain out, the solid parts of the upper roof will actually collapse down into the trough. So there are many areas down there that don't have nice smooth flows, but rather are just big heaps of talus. I think that's it for that one, Dan. So this would be close to the axis. This was one of the more recent flows. These are lobates, and you can see how they don't really look like pillows. At one time they were called lobate pillows, but we've changed that to really calling them a distinct type. You can also see in the upper right an open cavity where it has collapsed. We'll show a better picture of that later. You notice the very orange-yellow staining. That's hydrothermal staining, and sometimes these things are covered with microbiota because there's hot, warm fluids coming out through the channelways. These are more or less connected to each other, but not completely. It's like a whole one connected channelway, but they are connected. And if you look in the very forefront of this on the lower left, you can see another how open they are on the inside, that literally they're just a shell that can be a few centimeters thick sometimes. And underneath those shells are basically lava drips that we'll show you at some point. Here they are. So this is the underside of those lobate flows. And for a long time, we didn't recognize them. And then for the next part was we weren't exactly sure how they formed. Clearly, the vapor has to be, whatever the inside is there, can't be a vacuum. You don't have a vacuum on the seafloor. But you have to have an open cavity that's hot enough to allow the lava, the magma that's in there, and the crystallizing lava to quench on the surface. You see the upper surface is underneath, forming glass. And the underside is still hot enough to actually have that drip. And you can see the drips in various forms. Some of them very pointy, some of them just starting to drip. And even those rills on them basically are like when you have water running along the surface of a roof someplace. So this is an idea of how we think some of the lavas form and how they get off axis. Vapor underneath some of the sheet flows may actually help it flow by having sort of a vapor phase. So it skates along the bottom, helping the flows get off axis further than you normally would have them. That's it for that one. Oh, here's another one. This is right on the margin of the axial summit trough. Little looks like a rock lobster calatheid crab there, I guess, yep, for scale. You can see some of the collapsed lobates. So that terrain is very ubiquitous. And presumably when you come down for your dives, you have to think about landing in that first. You don't want to come down on a hydrothermal vent, so you will land off axis someplace, and that's the sort of terrain you might see. You can also see on the inside of them, at least in the middle. Can you point to that, Dan? In the middle, there's texture on the inside of those. They're little shelves, and they're very similar to the shelves. Oh yeah, on the bottom there too. Those shelves are very similar to what you see on the pillars, and we're not exactly sure how they form. They may be some vapor bubbles that form on the inside of those as they're cooling. But that's a typical lobate flows. Next one. This is what happens along the trough near a fissure. The fissure is off here on the left. Sometimes you see the lava draining back. Very often the lava that's in the axis is pretty chaotic. Maybe it's because it's running over debris that's in there already. You can imagine trying to get a nice formed lobate or sheet flow on something that's filled with talus. In the background, you can see one of our markers that was put out there in the 90s and it was run over by 2005, 2006 eruption. It still survives. There are some of them around. But that's sort of a jumbled flow, if you will. We have a number of different names for the chaotic flows that you sometimes see that are folded on top of themselves. They're not pillows, they're not lobates, they're just jumbles of very thin sheets. The picture in the upper right of the lava, you see the glassy surface, it's literally rolled over on itself to form sort of a very large rope or a fold. The next one. Here's a ropey lava, very much like a pohoihoi you would see in places. So sometimes they're regular, and you see the picture there, another marker that's been run over. These sheet flows and even the lobates are not very thick. They're not like the big meter-sized pillow lavas. Some of the sheet flows are literally only a few centimeters thick, which is hard to imagine how they survive being that thick without folding over and breaking on each other. Next one. Here's a good picture of some of the pillars that are remaining inside the AST. We don't see them outside. I have been in other places like Juan de Fuca where sometimes these survive off axis. On the EPR, I don't think we've ever seen any outside of the axis itself, but you can see on the left, it's basically against the wall of the AST, and you see those features that look like bathtub rings. They were called bathtub rings. They're actually sort of cuspate bubble-like, lenticular bubble-like features that form on the pillars and on the sides of the AST. Again, somewhat questionable about how they actually form. And the floor, you can see, again, chaotic mixture of talus a little bit on the left and some contorted jumbled flows in the middle. The sediment there is probably mostly hydrothermal. It hasn't been there probably long enough to form from pelagic sediment. Next. So there's a few pictures of what they look like looking down. That was taken with the MISO Dan's camera system. And you see pillows on the upper left. And then the next one in B, sort of what we call a Hackley sheet, where it's flat, but it's all broken up. C would be what lobates look like when you're looking down. And there's a good example of how you can see the difference between a well-formed pillow and the lobates that are much flatter in their aspect ratio. D would be a lineated sheet. E is like the lineated, but it starts to get folded. This happens sometimes around the edges of the lineated sheets. They fold up on themselves, or at the ends of the sheets. Inside the collapsed lobate, the roof of the lobate will collapse. You'll see this talus within the lobates. That's an F. G is a pillow tube. It's a little bit hard to see there, but you can see there's sort of interconnected tubules, glassy tubules that Dan's pointing to. And then what it looks like in the older terrain where the pillows get covered with sediment and they start to get fissured. This will take place a few kilometers off axis where you start to see the fissuring like that. Next one. So this is just a view, because some of you would ask, well, what about sediment? You know, can we sample it? How thick is it? This is what it looks like a kilometer east. And if you go 2 kilometers, it's maybe double that. You see there isn't a tremendous amount of it. And in many cases, it sort of piles up between the lobates or around some of the pillows that are off axis. This is mostly pelagic in this case, but it's really not very thick. And you have to get out to about 3 or 4 kilometers before it starts to cover over some of the volcanic terrain. Next one.
Okay, so Mike gave you a little bit of a quick tour of the volcanic morphology and features that we see at the 950 area. There is a wealth of information about the hydrothermal vents and the biology here. The hydrothermal vents were initially discovered in 1989 on a cruise that Rachel Heyman at the University of California at Santa Barbara and I led using the Argo mapping system. We were able to image all of the communities along quite a long section of the ridge axis over almost 90 kilometers. And then we went back in 1991 with Alvin to actually sample the vents and do some detailed investigations. And that was the sort of iconic cruise where we first discovered what it looks like to be involved in a mid-ocean ridge eruption or in its immediate aftermath. So I'm just going to show you a little bit of the imagery here. This happens to be BioVent, Bio9 vent, and the tube worm communities around it. This is imagery from back in the 1990s, mid-1990s, spawning tube worms. So there's a wealth of animal communities, and there is quite a large body of work that's been done by many biologists, microbiologists, hydrothermal chemists, working in this area. I again encourage you to look at both the Ridge 2000 East Pacific Rise article, that's the summary of all of that work, and to sort of look in detail at that. Tim Shank, who will be joining us on the ECS cruise as one of the mentors, actually produced a fair amount of the sort of time series information about the biology and colonization at this site following the 1991 eruption. And you see at the lower right here, one of the high temperature loggers that we had installed at TyVent was one of the high temperature vents that developed at the EPR in the mid-90s. This is a logger that measures the vent fluid temperature and can give you a proxy about vent behavior in a quite a crude way, but it's been quite important in terms of our understanding of how the hydrothermal vents in this area have evolved over time. And I mentioned before about how iconic that 1991 Alvin cruise was. This video that you're seeing here is the one that we've shown many times at meetings and whatnot, of what it was like when we first got to that site. We didn't see red hot lava coming out over black the lava flows, we saw all sorts of white, goopy, bacterial, matte material and byproducts that had been basically deposited because you had put a heat pulse into the upper part of the crust, and all of the bacteria that had been living in the crust were basically activated.
You mentioned that we had no idea what was going on.
Yeah, right. Well, it took about 3 dives to finally figure out that we were seeing something very different than what we had just 2 years earlier when Rachel and I did the surveys in 1989, and we finally realized that this is what happens when you have a mid-ocean ridge eruption. If you see this white bacterial met, that's a dead ringer for something having happened, for a heat pulse having come up into the shallow crust. And again, in 1991. The hydrothermal vents were still active, but making very, very big sort of smoky areas that were almost impenetrable to the Alvin pilots. They were not very happy with us. And then, just as a context, in 2007, this is one of Maya Tolstoy and Felix Waldhauser's ocean bottom seismometers that were overrun by the 2005-2006 lava flow that we imaged with Jason. More about that a little later. And again, this is a picture that's been seen and used oftentimes to describe the 1991 eruption. These are tube worms that we had imaged in 1989 as a lush tube worm community, and when we came back in 1991, they were overrun by this folded sheet flow here. And when we brought them to the surface on one of the dives, in March of 1991, they were sort of nicely barbecued, given hence the name. They didn't smell bad, so clearly they had been cooked pretty recently. Mike and I that year had a subsequent Alvin dive program at the Siqueiros Transform just south of this area, and we took one dive and came back a month later. And when we brought a bunch of tube worms up, because the biologist asked us to, they were just just completely putrefied and were smelling terrible, and they were ready to throw us over the side of the ship. But it again was perhaps anecdotal, but an important observational data point to note that the animals that had been affected by the 1990 eruption were in fact subjected to that eruptive pulse in the early part of March of 1991. And this was subsequently borne out by some of the polonium dating that Ken Rubin and Mike and others had done. So a lot of good evidence, and that basically started several decades of detailed investigations into the biology, chemistry, geology of this particular area, which we'll be fortunate enough to go back to in December. Again, just a few quick pictures to show what it looks like. Again, there's an enormous amount of time series information that we have here. This is the exact same place that you're looking at in the top left here in 1991, and then in 1992, all of that white bacterial byproduct was grazed off by the crabs and other mobile fauna. And here similarly in the B image and the D image, these are two of the same places here. Okay, again, coming back to the sort of map-based data that we have, we're fortunate that we have the 120 kilohertz side scan sonar, the near bottom towed side scan sonar, both pre-eruption, this one on the left-hand side, and post-eruption, this one here collected in 2007 by Scott White and Adam Sewell. And you can see these dark areas here. This is because the sound is basically just grazing off the terrain, and so it's not sending you back very many hard returns. White is strong returns and black is acoustic shadow. And so this is now very flat areas, and these are in fact are lava channels that were created during the 2005-2006 eruptions and distributed the lava flows far off axis, in some cases almost to 4 kilometers off axis. You can see, comparing this left-hand image to the right-hand image up here at about 951.5, this series of lava channels that erupted from this fissure right here. We see similar lava channels here, but we don't have the clear image of the fissure here, but there were many more here. And in fact, we did find fresh lavas in this area. But this is the kind of perspective that we're looking to gain in the Sentry side scan and near bottom bathymetry data that we will collect in December. So we'll be comparing that new data to these older maps and images to see if new lava channels have been created. If they have been, that's sort of a dead ringer for there having been an eruption, and that certainly is going to impact the kind of planning that the ECS participants do in terms of what they want to focus on. I mentioned before that we had set out some benchmarks. We realized because these eruptions are relatively thin, but they can transport things, for instance, like the OBSs, which they transported in some cases hundreds of meters from their original positions. We did go ahead in 2007 and laid out several benchmarks, 4 of them to be specific, in these areas along the axis where we'll be working. If there has been another eruption, we can use these as indicators of where the transport has gone and if in fact they have been covered over or partly covered over by the new eruptions. And there's a paper about this that Adam Sewell and Vicky Farini and others wrote, which is also in the PDFs that we've provided to you. So I'll turn this back over to Mike to talk a little bit about the implications for what happens down deep in terms of the mush zone and the melting processes.
Right. So this might be a little bit more detailed than you want to know, but I thought it was worthwhile talking about how we use the information on the surface to get at what's happening at depth. This is something from one of my postdocs, Adam Goss, that we put together with a number of us. On the top surface of that, the dark gray area is basically the outline of the 2005-2006 flow. The important point of this paper was we now had, for the first time, evidence of what the composition and distribution of the flow was from 1991 to 92. And in almost exactly the same area, we then had another eruption in 2005-2006. So we could tell a lot from the changes that went on, just like you can tell changes in biota or in hydrothermal vents. This was something we do petrologically. At the same time, there was a lot of information coming from geophysicists, the Scripps group and Suzanne Carbat's group, doing seismic reflection and refraction. So partly these interpretations are based upon what they were seeing as well. It turns out that the way the plumbing system works on the ridges is literally as almost like there are a number of sausages, sort of interconnected and related, but not necessarily seeing each other. So the upper parts of the magma chambers, if you will, are really lenses that lie underneath the different segments, and those segments can have different compositions. So here we're showing 2 segments in sort of tannish color, and the compositions were different between the northern segment, north of the so-called NARF, as you see, and in the 4 area, which is another composition. And they were both different than the 91-92. So obviously in decadal timescales, we can get changes in composition. And those are coming from these very thin melt lenses that are right underneath probably the dikes. And they're being fed by magmas that are coming from the mantle that probably pond deep. If you look at number 1, that's where the mantle melts are probably coming, where they fractionate and eventually form gabbros and cumulates. Number 2 is where you have a whole bunch of interaction taking place between melts and mush, basically crystals and liquid. And then finally it accumulates in a melt lens that will erupt. That is the image that we have now, and I think in general believed by most geochemists, petrologists. The next one, I think, shows some of the stuff that Suzanne has put together and her students. They've got some very detailed studies. It's way beyond what we can talk about here, but we can at least look at some of the pictures. If you look at the middle right, lower right, the gray image is basically the reflection profile, and what they've done there is they've labeled these little gaps. Those reflections basically represent the melt lenses. There's a incongruity between what solid rock is and what the melt is. So each one of those is its own little melt lens, and they may only be a few kilometers wide and a few hundred meters at most thick. And each one of them can have a slightly different composition. The bottom frame, where you have the colors, shows the geochemical data we have, and it shows that they're slightly different, even in similar times, like in 91, 92, and 2005, 2006. Those different segments erupted different compositions / temperatures of magma. They didn't have different sources, but they had different histories when they got up into the upper part of the crust. So the picture that she came up with in that paper in figure 3 in the upper left is one where you've got these segments that feed these little sausage-like melt lenses underneath, where you've got a yellow one and a tan one and a green one with slightly different compositions. And in between those sausages, you may actually have downflow of water that are feeding the hydrothermal vents. You can see in the very small inset in the very upper left. So that's sort of the picture that we're dealing with. Again, somewhat geofantasy, but we all try to develop models that we can relate to, I guess. So what's next, Dan? Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. That's the most of the sort of science review and the context that we wanted to give you. There's certainly an enormous amount of additional information. We haven't covered everything that we possibly could, especially in the sort of biological and microbiological specialties. The papers that we've got in the Dropbox have some of that, and certainly we've got sort of very complete reference lists, and we're happy to point you to those. But we didn't want to pretend to be biologists and microbiologists. But what we wanted to do is just give you a little bit of the context for the site that we're going to be working at. I wanted to just turn briefly in the last 10 minutes or so of the webinar to sort of where we'll be working in terms of the spaces on the ship, and then talk a little bit about Alvin and Sentry data acquisition. So you see, this is the RV Atlantis. You've got a couple of views of the main lab here, and me working with the clam, pretending to be a biologist in the wet lab. The layout of the ship on the main deck is down in this bottom section of the figure, and this is probably where we'll end up having people roost. Sentry generally stays here in the hydrographic laboratory because their vehicle sits over here, and that gives them good access to be able to get out to Sentry. Alvin, of course, is in its hangar. The wet lab will be used largely for the CTD and the rock teams. There's a rock saw in here that will be sawing rocks up. Everybody is going to be in the computer lab at various times doing things. The bioanalytical lab, which is forward on the port side of the ship, probably will have the fluid chemistry and perhaps the microbiology biology teams. The main lab will be shared between a whole bunch of different groups, rocks, geophysics teams, biology and microbiology teams. We'll have to sort of sort that out depending on fume hoods and whatnot. So that gives you a general sense of where you might be, and it's going to be a crowded space because we're doing lots of things, and there's lots of different disciplines that will need to be accommodated. So I just wanted to give you a very brief sort of introduction to the vehicles. You will note that the second webinar is scheduled for Friday, the 5th of October. Adam Sewell, the chief scientist for Deep Submergence, will be making this presentation to you, and we'll cover a lot more information. But basically, we're going to be using Sentry and Sentry right here, and Alvin. This is ROV Jason here, which we won't be using. Alvin is a submersible that, again, takes one pilot and two observers. It's got a large amount of payload. This imagery that you're seeing here is some that we collected back in 2016 using some of my MESO imaging systems of Alvin, working at some of the seamounts south of the area where we'll be working. It's got very capable manipulators. It's got a lot of mobility to do detailed sampling, and it'll have quite good video cameras, HD and 4K video cameras, as well as digital still cameras. So that's Alvin, and in general, you'll be working from about 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning, for those of you that will dive, to about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That's about the duration of a dive, from the time you get on board and go into the water to the time that you get back up on deck. This is Sentry, and again, it's an enormously capable autonomous vehicle that does high-resolution mapping of the seafloor. It is a superb companion vehicle for Alvin, because in the sort of 12 hours that you have in the evening when Alvin is charging its batteries, you can accomplish detailed mapping operations, and sometimes, in fact, oftentimes, those maps that Sentry makes the night before will inform the Alvin dive the next day, and we certainly will be able to take advantage of that because of the very rapid turnaround for a sort of a quick map from the Sentry group. They realized that they had to develop their data pipelines in such a way that Alvin could take advantage of what Sentry discovered the night before. So that's something which you'll be exposed to, and the ways in which you do the dive planning for both these vehicles is something that's very important, and I think is going to be a big part of the learning process for you. This is just some of the characteristics that Sentry has in terms of its depth capability and speed, and the kinds of instrumentation that is available to it. I think the thing that we wanted to leave you with is these sort of general key points that have to do with the planning for Alvin and Sentry dives. One, that a detailed dive plan has to be compiled for both Sentry and for Alvin. Those have to happen by the early afternoon that precedes the dive, and that's because both the pilots for Alvin and the vehicle operators for Sentry require a fair amount of time to do their dive planning and to make sure that their ballasting is correct. For Sentry, they have to run several models of the dive to make sure that they're covering all the terrain that you want them to, and if that requires them to do bathymetric mapping for part of it, side scan mapping for part of it, and detailed imaging using their camera systems for photomosaicing for part of it. They have to figure out how to organize and orchestrate all of that so that it all fits into the dive plan, and you get the data that you need. For Alvin, similarly, detailed dive plans are essential because, especially for these dives, we have biologists, microbiologists, chemists, geologists, geophysicists. So there's a lot of different requirements in terms of data to be collected and the kinds of samples to be collected, and each of those take time. So what we'll talk about in subsequent webinars, and also what we'll talk about on board, is how to plan for that, how to try to best accommodate your data acquisition needs to match the vehicle capabilities. And I think that part of that too has to be, how you prioritize your objectives. So that's another reason why this is a big sort of headline on this list here. Similarly for Alvin, the kind of sampling and the basket layout has to make sense so that you're doing things efficiently. And as I said before, for Sentry, the dive objectives and the sequence of objectives have to be organized so that you're acquiring the most data that you can during the time when it's on the bottom. And Adam will cover a lot of that when he gives the webinar on the NDSF vehicle operations. This is just a reminder about what happens during a day. So if everything is going well and the weather is good, which we hope it will be at that time of year, Alvin basically is ready to dive at 7:30. Hopefully is in the water by 8, and takes about an hour and a half to get down to the bottom. Spends about 6 hours on the bottom, and then comes up so that it's on deck by 1500, by 3 p.m. And then Sentry gets ready, does all of its pre-dive in that time period when Alvin is on deck and during dinner, and then they're ready to launch right after dinner, and then they get on deck just an hour and a half before Alvin is ready to launch. And it's in that hour and a half where they're downloading data, doing a quick look, and processing the bathymetry to see if there's something interesting that you want to go look at. Those are the kinds of things that the group is extremely responsive about. So I may have had that date wrong. It's October 4th or October 5th, whatever the Friday is in October. So I may have this wrong, but we'll be sending you out a reminder for sure. Again, Adam Sewell is going to be doing the presentation, and it will be an introduction to the National Deep Submergence Facility vehicles. So I'm going to exit out of the PowerPoint, and we'll be getting from Eric, who has been graciously helping us from AGU, to see if there are any questions that you have, so that we can go ahead and try to answer those as best we can in the remaining time. Let's see. Okay.
Yep, I'm here, Dan. So, yeah, we'd love to hear from you all. If you have any questions, we have about 10 minutes left. If you type into the chat box, you'll see there's a questions page. Just type it in, and we'll read it aloud and let the presenters answer. So we'll give folks a few seconds to start typing some questions.
Right.
Mike, I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to hit on before we start answering questions.
Yeah, and I apologize for the next one. We should remind people that they can do that as the presentation is proceeding. I forgot to mention that. I apologize.
Okay.
So I don't know if anybody who was there, if we can just have them turn on their mic, or is that going to be sort of chaos?
With webinars, they need to type it in. Unfortunately, yeah.
Oh, I see. Okay. And I would also say if you want to think about what we've said during the webinar, and if you prefer to send us an email about it, certainly you've got the email address for all of the conveners and the mentors. The other thing is we have a Slack channel that can be accessed, and there is a channel on there actually for the webinars. I was just going to think about how I would. Well, it's the webinar channel for the AT 4206 Slack site. So don't hesitate to put your questions there as well. But one way or the other, we will endeavor to be able to answer them.
Okay, we got a couple of questions in. So the first was from Holly. Can you explain the difference between hydrothermal sediments and other background sediments?
Between hydrothermal sediment and other background sediments.
Yep.
Oh, okay. Well, the hydrothermal sediments that Mike was pointing out in some of those pictures generally are those yellowish to orange hydrothermal clays that are developed as the byproducts of the fallout from the hydrothermal plumes from the vents. That's one thing. The other thing is we know that in fact there may be explosive activity associated with some of the eruptions, and some of those volcanic deposits can alter quite quickly. The volcanic glass on the lava flows does devitrify, and it forms hyaloclastites. And it forms a palagonite, which is another sort of clay with its interaction with seawater. So, but the hydrothermal sediments generally aren't too thick here, and you also can accumulate those sediments by having the chimneys sort of grow up and topple over and grow up and topple over, and so they form sort of a coarse deposit, if you will, of hydrothermal sediment. Mike, do you want to add to that?
No, okay. So from Patricia, she asks, could you say a little more about balancing science objectives during Alvin dives? For example, if there are biology, chemistry, and geology goals for a single dive, how that collaboration process might work?
Well, I guess I'll just answer by saying part of that will have to do with where we're going. If there's an objective that is going to, for instance, Bio9 vent and P vent, which is sort of the two classic hydrothermal vents in this area that have remained active even throughout the two eruption cycles. We'll have to figure out how much time it will take to collect how many water samples, what kind of water samples want to be acquired, whether those water samples are, whether people need to be able to filter some of those with the suction sampler on Alvin, or whether they just need to collect hot hydrothermal fluids. So there'll have to be a lot of discussion among both the fluid people and the biologists, microbiologists, to try to coordinate all of those activities. And then, of course, if you want to collect rocks as well. So part of it is going to be making sure we've got the right and enough basket space for the different kinds of sampling. And part of it is on a dive by dive basis, prioritizing what kind of samples need to be acquired depending on the early career folks design the dives and the experiments they want to carry out. Mike, you want to add to that?
Sure. Well, so a lot of times with the geology, it's sometimes we have dedicated dives to it, particularly if we're going off axis and there's no hydrothermal activity. I don't see that happening here, but I do see people landing off axis. And what we would often do was get a sample. You know, it doesn't take very long. The pilots are pretty good at it. Just grab a sample, document where it comes from, put it in the basket, and move on. If it turns out that it really does look like there was an eruption, either from the side scan or even from observations or the mapping, then it's going to change things, because it will be important to take more samples and have a plan for doing that for maybe an hour and then going into the axis. Because once you get in the axis and you start to sample and you're doing biology and chemistry, it takes a fair amount of time to do that. But certainly from the rock point of view, a lot of times it's grab as you can. Like before you come up, grab a sample. When you first get down, grab a sample. But yeah, it's hard. The balance is actually pretty hard to do, and you never really know the amount of time it's going to take to do the different tests. They take a lot longer than you think they're going to take.
So I'll just make a comment, and again, Adam will talk more about this. But you know, in order to get good hydrothermal fluid samples, especially high temperature fluid samples, it requires you to have the pilot set up properly. Meaning, oftentimes these vents, sometimes they have to be hovering 4 or 5 meters above the seafloor. It's not like they can always rest on the seafloor. So in that case, the setup is key, because the vents sometimes are closely enough spaced so that the tail of Alvin may be pointing into another hot smoker, which you definitely don't want to do, because you don't want to start burning things up on the submarine. So there's a lot of detail required to make sure that you plan well what you want to sample, where you want to sample it, making sure that you're, again, doing it efficiently. And in terms of how long it takes, if you're set up properly, you know, getting some high temperature fluid samples with the major samplers may take 15 or 20 minutes each. On the other hand, if you're having trouble setting up, they may take a half an hour each. That's the kind of thing that we'll need to be, you know, talking about when we're actually doing the detailed dive planning. Is there another question?
Yeah, we have one more question from Nicholas. Can you describe how the dives will work with onshore participants?
Okay, so that's a good question, and we're trying to optimize how well we can do that by having an expanded bandwidth for the Atlantis during that period of time. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah, you're coming good.
I'm coming and going?
No, you're coming in. You're loud and clear.
Oh, okay. All right. So we're expecting to have
Oh, there you go. I couldn't hear for a while there.
Okay. So we're expecting to have expanded bandwidth through the fact that NSF has paid for us to have expanded bandwidth, and we've got the folks at Scripps who manage the fleet broadband to be able to help us not only with getting contiguous broadband coverage for that cruise, but also to use some of the unused bandwidth that some of the other research ships that are going to be in port won't be using. So that's the first thing, is communication, because ultimately that's going to be a big part of how we interact with the shore-based folks. But we are planning to have daily debriefs and discussions about what we found on the dive, what we're planning to do on the next dive, so that the early career shore-based folks can interact with the shipboard folks. In some cases, if samples are being taken for the shore-based people, there will be a need for them to interact with the folks on board the ship that are actually processing the samples or cataloging them. So these are the kinds of things that we are going to need to have discussions about on the Slack site and in additional sort of Zoom conference calls that we do over the next several months. It will be challenging, but I think that it will be something that will be worthwhile. And again, we're trying to optimize it in terms of how well we can function. But the idea is to try, because we were limited in how many people could come on board the ship because of space, we wanted to try to work with as many shore-based participants as possible. So communication is going to be key, and that can be done both during the daily sort of debriefs. And if the bandwidth is working well enough, then there is going to be other times when we'll be able to have communications with shore-based participants on sort of smaller groups that can talk specifics about particular samples or particular data. Okay.
So we don't have any other questions. I don't know if you want to give any parting notes, Dan. It's 3 o'clock.
Okay, well, I think we did okay in terms of timing for this first one. I thank everybody who participated, and we really appreciate it. We're looking forward to working with all of you. And again, I think I may have the date on the actual PowerPoint wrong. I think it's October 5th, not October 4th. Is that first Friday in October? But the webinars will be on Friday from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern time. Always, and we've got another 3 of them scheduled. But there will be other calls that we'll be organizing with the shipboard and shore-based folks separate from these general webinars. Mike, anything to close out with?
The only other thing that I think that I forgot to say was part of the reason for giving you this background and showing you the lava flows and things is when you're down, you're going to have a recorder, and you will be recording all the time. It's very important for you to be able to describe things. So as a microbiologist, you're going to need to have the vernacular for a petrologist. As a petrologist, you need to have the vernacular for a macrobiologist to be able to say what it is that you're seeing and have it recorded. So that's part of the reason that you need to think about this and not just say, well, I'm not a petrologist, so I don't really need to do it. No, you need to be able to describe what you're seing.
Right. Yeah, really good point. And we'll be going over a lot of this during the cruise and also before the cruise. But I sort of agree 100% with what Mike said. It is a really important point. And frankly, this is one of the things that I think we're trying to strive for, is to have especially the early career folks be cognizant of what their colleagues in other disciplines are doing, what they're interested in, and how they are going about collecting their data, describing their data, so that they can be better informed and so that their science can benefit from that sort of greater perspective that comes from looking at it, not just from your disciplinary perspective, but from the broader perspective of many disciplines.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you, AGU. Eric, thanks very much to you and Nathaniel and Nancy and others for all of your help in getting this organized.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And yeah, the next webinar will be on October 5th.
Okay. On October 5th. Great. Okay. Right. And I'll be correcting that PowerPoint, because we'll make this PowerPoint available to everybody as well on the Dropbox site.
Okay, sounds great. Have a good one.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you all.
Good weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.